The first thing Elena Vega heard inside the dead mine was breathing. Not a person, not an animal, the mountain itself. Cold air slipped out through a narrow slit in the red cliff, steady as a sleeping giant. Behind her stood Mateo, with one lame mule, a cracked handcart, and a folded bank receipt that said they now owned the place every miner in Coldwater had refused to enter. $6. That was the price of their future. Below Ash Mesa, the town windows burned warm and yellow. Men were laughing around the stove in Pike's Mercantile, already turning Elena and Mateo into a joke before the night was over. Old Hiram Pike had warned them with that thin banker's smile. "First hard snow," he said, "that mine will close its mouth and keep you." Mateo had not answered him. Elena had. Not with words. She had reached into her coat, touched the empty seam where the last coins had been sewn, and walked up the ridge anyway. Now the mine opened in front of them like a wound. Mateo raised the lantern. Its flame bent sideways in the draft. "You still feel it?" he asked. Elena held her palm near the crack. The air was not stale. It was moving. Somewhere beyond the broken tunnel, the mountain had space inside it. Darkness, then at the town below them. "We bought what they were too afraid to measure," she said. Then they stepped in. The first tunnel was barely wide enough for a man to turn his shoulders. Old timbers leaned from the walls, black with damp and age. Rusted rail spikes jutted from the floor like broken teeth. Water tapped from the ceiling into shallow puddles, each drop echoing deeper than it should have. The mule refused after 30 feet. Mateo tied it near the entrance and carried the lantern forward alone. Elena followed with one hand on the wall. Her father had worked coal seams before fever took him, and when she was a girl he had taught her that mines told the truth through air. Dead places held still. Living places breathed. This one breathed hard. After 40 yards, the tunnel ended in a collapse. Red rock and splintered support beams blocked everything from floor to roof. Mateo stood in front of it, quiet for a long moment. Then his face fell. "All this," he whispered. He struck the nearest stone with the heel of his hand. The sound died without returning. Elena did not move at first. She listened. There, behind the rubble, a faint whistle. She crouched, pressed her cheek near a gap between two stones, and felt the cold thread of air slide across her skin. "Mateo." He knelt beside her. She held his hand to the crack. His eyes changed. There was room behind the cave-in. Not a tunnel, a chamber. They slept that night just inside the mouth of the mine, wrapped in feed sacks beside a fire so small it looked ashamed to be alive. Coyotes cried below the ridge. The town bells rang once for evening, and after that only the wind spoke. At dawn, they began to dig. Mateo swung the pick until his hands opened. Elena pulled loose stones one by one, listening after every shift of weight. They could not afford powder. Could not afford another team. They could not even afford fresh rope. So they moved the mountain by inches. By the third day, the mule had learned to drag small loads of stone from the tunnel mouth. By the fifth day, Mateo's palms were wrapped in strips torn from his undershirt. By the eighth day, Elena found the old roof beam that held the whole collapse in place. It was rotten through the center. "If we cut wrong," Mateo said, "the rest comes down." Elena studied the pressure lines, the tilt of each slab, the way dust trembled in the draft. "Then we do not cut wrong." They shaved the beam slowly, a finger's width at a time. Matteo wedged 2 new braces into place, both made from mesquite trunks they had dragged up the slope. Elena drove a pry bar under the largest stone and waited for the mountain to decide whether they lived. The stone shifted. A low groan moved through the tunnel. Matteo froze. Then the wall folded inward. Dust exploded into the lantern light. Cold air rushed past them so hard it nearly killed the flame. When the dust cleared, the lantern shone into emptiness. Elena stepped through first. The chamber beyond the collapse was enormous. Its ceiling rose into blackness. Stone shelves climbed the walls in natural tiers. Along one side, a dry ledge curved above the floor like a balcony. Near the back, a narrow vertical shaft climbed toward daylight somewhere high in the mesa, just wide enough to pull smoke. Matteo lifted the lantern higher. The light did not reach the far wall. He laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because his body had no other place to put the shock. Elena. She was already kneeling in the dust. With a broken nail, she drew lines across the floor. "Animals down low," she said. "Their heat rises." Another line across the stone shelf. "We sleep here, above damp, above drafts." Another mark near the back wall. "Food high, dry, bats." Matteo stared at the plan taking shape in dust. "You are drawing a house inside a mine." "No," Elena said. She looked up into the breathing dark. "I am drawing winter's mistake." 3 days later, they went back into Coldwater for supplies. The mercantile fell silent the moment they entered. Hiram Pike stood behind the counter in his gray vest, polishing a scale weight that was already clean. Beside the stove, Caleb Mott tilted his chair back and grinned. "Well," Caleb said, "the cliff rats survived their first night." Laughter moved through the room. Matteo kept his voice even. "We need nails, lamp oil, 2 sacks of flour, and any rope you can spare." Pike set the scale weight down. "Cash?" Matteo did not answer. Pike's eyes slid to Elena's mud-stained skirt, then to the torn cloth around Matteo's hands. "You spent your cash on a condemned mine." "We have timber coming," Matteo said. "We can pay after the first thaw." Caleb laughed harder. "Timber? For what? A church for bats?" Elena looked at him. Not sharply, not loudly, just long enough. The grin faded from Caleb's face before he understood why. Pike cleared his throat. "No credit. Not for a hole that will bury the debt with you." The room waited for Matteo to rage. Instead, Elena picked up their empty sack. "Then we will need nothing from this room." Outside, cold rain had begun to fall. Behind the mercantile window, men returned to their warm stove and their easy jokes. Matteo stopped in the street. "We have no nails." Elena looked up at the mesa. "We have wood." "No rope." "We have rawhide." "No flour." She turned toward him then, and her face was tired in a way he had never seen. "We have $6 worth of mine," she said, "so we make it worth more." The next morning they started with trees. Ash Mesa did not give up timber kindly. Pine grew high along the north ravine, where the slope turned cruel and the rocks rolled underfoot. Matteo cut until his arms shook. Elena stripped branches, measured lengths by her own stride, and marked each beam for a purpose before it ever left the forest. The first trunk nearly crushed the mule. It broke loose from the drag line, rolled sideways, and slammed into a boulder with a crack that bounced across the ridge. Matteo ran after it, slipped, and disappeared behind a spray of mud. Elena screamed his name. He rose slowly, one shoulder bleeding, his hat gone. For a moment they only stared at each other. Then Elena walked to the fallen trunk and pressed both hands against the bark. "One beam," she said, breathing hard. Matteo looked at the hill above them, still crowded with trees. "One beam," he answered, "and a mountain full of fools." They changed their method after that. No more dragging whole trunks downhill. Elena built rolling cradles from short logs and lashed the larger beams onto them. Matteo carved shallow tracks in the mud so the timber would slide where they wanted instead of where gravity wanted. When the mule tired, they used counterweight stones. When the rawhide stretched, Elena braided it tighter and soaked it overnight. Every improvement was born from something almost killing them. Inside the chamber, the dead mine began to change. A low animal pen took shape across the floor, framed in heavy timber and backed by stone. Above it, Matteo and Elena raised a sleeping platform along the dry ledge. Near the back wall, they built a hearth from flat rock and clay, feeding smoke toward the natural shaft Elena had found. The first time smoke lifted cleanly into the dark instead of choking the room, Matteo leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. "That should not work," he said. Elena wiped soot from her cheek. "It does not care what it should do." For weeks, hammer strikes replaced silence. The chamber answered every sound until it felt as if unseen workers swung tools in the dark beside them. The mule slept below. The fire warmed the stone. The stone gave the warmth back slowly through the night. That was the first proof. The mountain did not only shelter heat, it held it. One evening, while Matteo was fitting a crossbeam above the lower pen, hoofbeats stopped outside the mine. He reached for the axe. A man stood in the entrance, holding a coil of chain. Jonah Reed, the blacksmith, had come alone. He was a broad man, with soot permanently settled into the creases of his hands. In town, he spoke less than anyone, and listened more than they liked. Matteo stepped down from the beam. "You come to measure the grave?" Jonah looked past him into the chamber. His expression changed in the lantern light. "No," he said. "See why smoke was climbing from the top of a dead mesa." Elena walked out from behind the hearth. Jonah studied the pen, the ledge, the rising walls, the stones stacked around the clay firebox. "You built a stove inside the cliff." "A home," Elena said. Jonah set the coil of chain on the ground. Then he placed 2 iron sheaves beside it, both heavy enough to lift wagon axles. "Use these before you break your necks." Matteo stared at the iron. "We cannot pay you." Jonah's eyes moved to Matteo's bandaged hands. "You already paid. Pike would spend $50 looking for a reason not to try. You two spent 6 and started swinging." Elena touched one of the iron wheels. It was cold, real, and strong. Jonah turned to leave, then stopped at the entrance. "Storms are lining early north of the pass," he said. "If you mean to finish this madness, finish it fast." After he rode away, Matteo stood over the chain a long time. Then he whispered, "Somebody saw it." Elena shook her head. "No, somebody saw us." The sheaves changed everything. Matteo built a windlass from an old wagon hub and anchored it between two stone pillars. Elena designed a lift line that raised beams from the chamber floor to the ledge without making a man stand beneath them. They tested every knot, every brace, every angle. The first beam rose smoothly. The chain clicked over iron. Wood climbed into lantern light. Elena guided the end into a notch carved against the stone shelf. Matteo locked it with a wedge. When they stepped back, the beam held. It held the next morning, too. After that, the shelter grew upward. Lower level for animals and bulk firewood, middle ledge for sleeping, cooking, and repair work, upper shelves for flour, dried beans, apples, salt pork, medicinal herbs, spare blankets, and every scrap of kindling small enough to save. Elena sealed cracks where wind cut too hard, but left 2 vents open so the air would keep moving. She hung wet cloth near the entrance to watch drafts, stored food where the cloth dried fastest. She marked a red line on the stone floor after each rain to see where water crept in and built everything important above it. Matteo laughed the first time he saw the marks. "You are teaching the cave manners." "No," Elena said. "I am learning its temper." By late autumn, they had 2 goats, the mule, 3 sacks of beans bought with firewood, 8 jars of rendered fat, and enough pine stacked along the back wall to make the chamber smell like a forest trapped underground. They also had 1 silver coin left. Elena kept it wrapped in blue thread inside her coat, not for luck, for proof. Whenever the work felt impossible, she held it in her palm and remembered that everything around them had begun smaller than that coin. Then came the accident. Matteo was raising the last roof brace above the sleeping ledge. It was the largest beam they had cut, a dark pine trunk squared flat on 2 sides. Elena stood below, guiding the lift line away from the hearth. The chain jumped. 1 iron tooth slipped. The beam dropped. Matteo shoved Elena backward with both hands. The pine crashed down where she had been standing. Stone cracked. Sparks burst from the hearth ring. The mule screamed below. Dust swallowed the lanterns. For several seconds there was no sound except rock settling in the dark. Then Elena crawled toward Matteo. He was on his knees, 1 arm hanging wrong, blood running from his temple. "You pushed me," she said. He tried to smile. Seemed polite. She grabbed his coat and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. That night, no tools rang. The unfinished brace lay across the floor like a warning. Outside, the first snow touched the mesa. Inside, Matteo's arm swelled under strips of cloth, and the fire snapped low. "We can still go," he said. Elena looked at him across the fire. Where? South? Any place without a mountain waiting to fall. She turned the silver coin between her fingers. Edge caught the lantern light. "If we leave," she said, "Pike was right." Matteo closed his eyes. "That man is not worth dying over." "No." Elena looked toward the half-built walls above the animal pen. "But we are worth living for." Before dawn, she climbed the ledge alone and reset the lift line. Matteo cursed at her until he realized she was not listening. Then he stood, tied his injured arm against his chest, and worked the windlass with the other. The last brace rose before sunset. Winter arrived 2 days later. It did not come gently. It came like a door kicked open by God. Wind hit Ash Mesa so hard the entrance timbers shuddered in their sockets. Snow poured sideways past the mine mouth until the world outside disappeared. The sky turned white. The trail vanished. The town bell rang once, then was cut off by the storm. Inside the mine, the goats stamped in their pen. The mule shifted but did not panic. Warm air climbed from the animals, crossed the sleeping ledge, and moved toward the smoke shaft exactly as Elena had planned. The clay hearth glowed red. The stone walls, heated day after day, gave back their stored warmth like a second fire. Matteo stood beside the entrance and listened. Over Coldwater. It was sitting down on it. By morning, the lower half of the door was buried. Matteo and Elena dug it clear from the inside twice. By noon, they stopped. Opening it wasted heat, and the mountain was holding. That was the second proof. Their impossible house did not merely survive winter. It trapped life. Near dusk, something struck the outer door. Once, then again. Not wind. A hand. Matteo lifted the bar. Snow collapsed inward as Jonah Reed fell through the opening, blue-lipped, crusted in ice, and barely able to crawl. Elena and Matteo dragged him to the hearth. His coat had frozen stiff. His beard was white. One glove was missing. Elena wrapped his hands, while Matteo held broth to his mouth. Jonah coughed until his whole body shook. "The schoolhouse," he rasped. Matteo leaned closer. "What about it?" Jonah's eyes opened, and what Elena saw there made the chamber feel colder. Roof split. Stovepipe buried. Pike moved half the town there when the mercantile wall gave way. He swallowed hard. They have children under flour sacks. Miss Larkin's boy stopped shivering. No one spoke. Outside, the storm beat against the buried entrance like an animal that knew there was meat inside. Matteo looked around the chamber. The food shelves, the blankets, the animals, the warmth. The place had been built because Coldwater had offered them nothing but laughter. Now Coldwater was freezing less than 2 miles below. Jonah stared up at the timber levels climbing through the mine. "You actually did it," he whispered. Elena was already gathering rope. Matteo turned to her. "No." She kept moving. "Elena." She tied one coil around her shoulder and handed him the other. "You know the ravine in Whiteout," she said. "Jonah knows who cannot walk. I can keep the door and the hearth ready." Matteo's jaw tightened. "You want me to go down there for Pike?" "No." She looked at him then. "I want you to come back with the children." The words struck harder than the wind. Matteo looked at Jonah. The blacksmith could barely sit upright. Matteo took the rope. Elena stepped close and tied the end around his waist herself. At the door, he stopped. "What if I lose the fence line?" Elena placed the silver coin into his gloved hand. "Then hold this and remember where all $6 went." He almost laughed. Then the door opened and the storm swallowed him whole. Matteo followed the fence by touch, not sight. There was no sight left in the world. Snow filled his lashes until every blink scraped. Ice sealed his scarf to his beard, him off his feet again and again. But the wire was there, half buried and humming under the storm. He kept one hand on it until the skin tore inside his glove. Once, the fence disappeared under a drift taller than his chest. He dug until his fingers found it. Once, he heard something crack above him and threw himself forward as a pine limb smashed into the snow behind his legs. Once, he dropped the coin. For one terrible moment, he clawed through white nothing like a man searching for his own heartbeat. Then his fingers closed around it. He kept moving. The schoolhouse appeared as a dark shape in the blizzard, half buried, its roof sagging under snow. Mateo pounded on the door with a fence rail until someone opened it. A smell of smoke, sickness, and cold spilled out. Inside, Coldwater was no longer laughing. Men huddled against the wall with blankets over their shoulders. Women held children close beneath curtains torn from the windows. Hiram Pike sat near the stove with his polished boots wrapped in burlap. Caleb Mott's fingers were bandaged black at the tips. Miss Larkin looked up from a child lying too still in her lap. Mateo stood in the doorway, covered in ice. For a second, nobody understood what they were seeing. Pike whispered, "You're alive." Mateo looked at the dying stove, the cracked roof beam, the faces turned toward him like prisoners hearing keys. "Anyone who can walk stands now," he said. "Walk gets carried." Caleb opened his mouth, but no joke came out. Pike struggled to his feet. "Where are we going?" Mateo lifted the rope. "To the hole you called our grave." They tied themselves together in a line, Mateo at the front, Caleb behind him carrying Miss Larkin's boy, Pike in the middle with two little girls gripping his coat. Jonah, after 1 hour of warming, had stumbled back down with a second rope and took the rear. The storm tried to tear them into separate lives. It failed because the rope would not let it. People fell, people screamed. The wind stole every name before it could travel, slipped from tired arms and were dragged back by the line. Pike vanished waist-deep into a drift and came up sobbing, not from shame, but because he had believed money made him heavier than snow. It did not. Halfway up the ravine, Miss Larkin's boy stopped breathing right. Mateo heard the change even through the wind. He turned, took the child from Caleb, and held him inside his coat against his own chest. "Keep walking," he shouted. "I can't feel my feet," someone cried. "Then use the rope." Step by step, the line climbed. At the mine, Elena had the door open before they reached it. She had heard the rope bells Mateo tied near the trail, little scraps of tin that rang under the storm when the line pulled close. The hearth was roaring. Blankets lay across the ledge, broth steamed in every pot they owned. The first survivor stumbled inside and stopped so suddenly the line nearly broke behind him. Because the grave was warm. Lanterns hung from beams fitted tight against stone. Goats breathed below. The mule stood alive in its pen. Food jars lined the upper shelves. Smoke climbed clean through the dark shaft. Above the animal floor, the sleeping ledge glowed amber with firelight. People entered weeping before they knew they were crying. Miss Larkin's boy from Mateo and laid him near the hearth. She rubbed his chest, warmed stones for his feet, and fed broth between his lips, 1 drop at a time. Caleb Mott stood under the beams with snow melting from his hat. He looked at Elena, then at Mateo, then at his own hands. "I said this place would be a grave," he whispered. Elena did not answer. She had no room left in her for revenge. Hiram Pike stood beneath the upper shelves, staring at the stored food, the careful vents, the red water line marked on the floor, the beams wedged so tight they seemed grown from the mountain. His mouth trembled. "All this," he said hoarsely, "with $6. Mateo untied the frozen rope from his waist. "No." He looked at Elena, then at the people warming around the hearth. "With $6, we bought a door." Elena placed the silver coin on the stone beside the fire. "The rest," she said, "we built." The blizzard lasted 3 more days. Outside, Coldwater disappeared under snow deep enough to bury wagons. The mercantile roof collapsed before dawn on the second day. The schoolhouse never would have lasted the night. When the wind finally broke, 43 people were asleep inside Ash Mesa. 9 animals were alive below them. Every child had warm hands. First time since they had climbed the ridge, no one called the mine dead. In spring, the town rebuilt closer to the mesa, not because the mountain was kind, because Elena had listened before anyone else did. Years later, when children asked why the old shelter beams still stood inside the red cliff, their parents told them about the winter Coldwater learned the price of laughter. They told them about a lame mule, 1 silver coin, a breathing mine, and 2 people who bought what everyone else feared. And if those children stood very still at the entrance, they could feel it too. Cold air moving through the stone. Not a warning anymore, a reminder. It had not swallowed Elena and Mateo. It had kept every promise they were brave enough to hear.